Hello, welcome back to Walkabout, your mobile travel diary. In today's episode I'm going to point out some difference between UIKit and SwiftUI when creating forms. If you followed the channel for a while, you know that I originally built Walkabout using UIKit. But since the development of iOS 13 in SwiftUI, I'm slowly converting parts to SwiftUI. And in the last couple of days, I've been working on my trip edit view. It's a simple form with some controls on it. And I did already an episode how I do the photo picker, how I do optional dates in the form. And now I just want to show you, for sake of, let's say, comparison UIKit with SwiftUI, what I had to do in UIKit and what I do today in SwiftUI, and how, in my opinion, it become a lot easier to create simple forms. So let me first show the two forms. They're almost equal. I made a little bit of difference when converting it to SwiftUI, not because I couldn't build it, but much more because I had some user feedback. So let's show you first the original form here. Now here we see a simulator that is running iOS 11, has the original form. It has a cover picture first. This is one of the things that I've changed when I moved it over to SwiftUI, because people found it confusing to have this big screen image in their face. Well, the trip has a name, a description. You can decide whether you want to share it or not, a start date, a location, and the location opens a picker where you can find for a location, and the date pops up a date control, and that's about it. And you can save it, and you have created your trip, and then you can start posting within your trip. Now let's go to the new form that is here running on a device with iOS 15. So we can start it. We can go and create the same screen. Now you see it looks a little bit different because I chose to this standard layout instead of the original, let's say, original list layout for the form. But I have a name, description, I have my cover image that I changed by using a picker to do it this way, and then I have my public sharing, my date. I did a full episode on the optional dates, and I did an episode on the location picker, so I won't go into those at this point, but as you see, it's a fairly simple form. Now let's get first through the code briefly of UIKit, and then I will go through the code of SwiftUI, and you can clearly see the differences, and I'll also explain why I think that the SwiftUI is a lot easier to use than the UIKit. So here I have my form in UIKit, and you see I use here an external library, Eureka, for forms. Now in the past I have built forms fully from scratch with table views, but then you need to do the collapsing and expanding with date pickers. It's a nightmare. Can be done, but it's a lot of work. So for this project, and a long time ago already, I decided to use Eureka form controls, and they're great, they work very nice, but still it's an external dependency that, number one, I don't need anymore now in SwiftUI. So Eureka, I have my form here on the view load. I compose my form with the section with the header, with my name as you saw, my description, privacy, and all the controls are here. But there's a few things to remember. For this header, I had to create my own header view because there is no standard Eureka form control that does this full screen picture, etc. And it's additional work to make a custom field for this Eureka forms. And the same was true here for my map item row. So where I pick a location, I also had to create a custom field for my Eureka library to do that. What was a bit of work to get that all working. I have the form, and that form is completed. Some helper functions to get to the header view because that's a sub view, etc. But yes, it's doable, but it was a bit complex. Now, then, of course, we have the save action. We validate the form. This is an advantage because that is standard of the form library, so you don't need to worry about it. Once you configured your validations, it will validate, show an error message, and then I get the form data, and depending on whether I'm in edit mode or in create mode, I either do an update or I do a create. And these create functions here, I don't go into detail in the update function here. That's just dealing with the business logic to get the fields from the form and store them correctly into my data store. And actually those functions haven't changed when I moved from UIKit to SwiftUI. So there were a copy of paste, and there were only a few differences here when I, for instance, dismiss the form, and in my UIKit I use a delegate to dismiss it from the parent. And of course that is a little bit different, but the basic logic for updating the data store is exactly the same, and it was starting with the copy paste and fine-tuning it a little bit. So the differences are not there. Now, as I mentioned, I needed a trip header control for that, with outlets and a zip file associated to that to do that, but I will not go into those details because I made that obsolete, so it's not fair to compare there. Then we can go to the SwiftUI view. In the SwiftUI, if you followed the channel as well, you notice that I use a very common pattern. I have a view and a view model, and I almost literally always have a view associated to a view model one-to-one. One, the view for the user interface, and the model for the business logic. So here again I have my view, and that associates with a view model, and I create a form in the form with sections, the trip with the text field for the name, something for the description, and I build this to make a nicely growing description field, and I will probably capture this into a separate field. I have my photo picker field. This photo picker field, as you saw in the form, I can show it here, I think again, is this photo picker field where I can pick a photo, but this is actually code that I reused from my post editor. So there's also an episode on how I did a photo picker in SwiftUI that you can study to see how I did that, but that is just a simple thing that I did there. And then I have my privacy toggle. I have a section with the date picker field and the place picker field for the start, date and place, and of course the same for the end, that I also did in another video. But roughly this part is the same as we saw here on top where we compose the form. There's not that much difference. You compose the form in UIKit, you compose the form in SwiftUI. With that exception, that in the SwiftUI version I can do it without any external dependencies, what is a big plus in my opinion. Then of course in the toolbar we have some actions to dismiss and to save it, and well, then we call the view model to save it. Then in the view model on top here we first define the variables that need to be bound to the form. So the form is binding to fields, to variables in my view model. So once I change something in the form, it's updated in the view model. And that's why I need to use these published variables. And for instance, if I set the image, I just need to keep a flag that the image is dirty. Otherwise I start unnecessarily uploading not changed images and overriding them. It's just a little bit of an, let's say, efficiency thing, but could be without. I have a little bit of a valid. You must have a name with at least 3 characters in your trip, even though it does work if you leave the name empty, but it looks very ugly. And then I initialize the view model. And there's 2 ways to initialize. What you saw in my example, I initialize it to create a trip, so the trip is empty, but there's also a way that you can go to a trip. I'll show you here. Go to a trip. And I can press the edit here of the trip, and I get the form, of course, populated with all the fields that belong to that trip. And that's what I do here. So if I initialize the trip, I set all the variables in my form to the trip. I retrieve the image. The image can be cached, cannot be cached, can be remotely retrieved. And I need to make sure that once the retrieval happened, that the image is set to non-dirty, because if you don't change it, you don't need to re-upload it. Function to store the image is the same as I had here as a store header image, just a little bit of a different name. I had here store the header image, same logic, do a little bit of resizing, and then of course my trip create is the same. Trip update is the same on success, and the trip delete, because in case of opening it from a trip, so if you've initialized it with the trip, I also show a delete button to delete the trip, and then there's a little bit of logic to deal with that. And in short, whereas in UIKit I relied on an external library to compose the form, and now in SwiftUI I just use the standard form variables and the standard form control to compose my form. Of course, in UIKit I had to create a special header item, and now I created a photo picker item for that. I had something to pick a place picker field, and in the UIKit version I needed to create custom Eureka form controls, what was a lot more complex than I had to do in SwiftUI, because now I could use standard SwiftUI to compose my place picker view as I showed in the previous video. Overall, I am very happy with creating simple forms in SwiftUI. I know SwiftUI isn't there 100% to replace everything in UIKit, but for this kind of simple forms, also using them in your UIKit application, in my opinion, they're great, they're simple, they're very straightforward to use, and there's still one form for my profile that I will also very soon replace with UIKit, because for me it's just a lot easier, they're easier to maintain, they're faster to create, and I can get rid of an external dependency. Now, that external dependency was actually the reason why I started converting my forms, because I want to make the app also available on a Mac, and I had some troubles compiling it with Catalyst, etc., that I thought I can go and fix that, or I can just make the form Eureka library obsolete, and I go on the path of making the Eureka library obsolete. So, I hope you liked it. If you like it, please like and subscribe. If you didn't like it, subscribe anyway, because the next video might be better for you. I'll thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.